is Jabaar Mohamed, and you are watching Accessibility with Jabaar. So what our show is about, it's about the misconceptions within our communities about disability, and we engage in conversations and also share information with the broader community to benefit a more inclusive environment. On today's show, we have a very special guest. His name is Shuab Chalklen, and he will be joining us today, sharing his experience, his advocacy work, and he's also will be sharing his experience as a disabled person. We will be showing also a short clip on everything that he's been involved in international fields, in national as well as provincial and regional. He's worked in many different fields as a stakeholder and always advocating for disability to make sure that disabled people are included and their rights are recognized. So let's take a look a bit more about what he does and a bit more about what he's about.
That it was so inspiring to listen to the self-advocates earlier, and it took me back to my own childhood. It was a very personal, emotional experience listening to them, because I became disabled in South Africa when I was 15 years old. We lived in a very violent country, as you all know, the past of South Africa. And I became disabled at the age of 15 as a result of a gunshot wound. And it was a difficult society to grow up in as a disabled person. Very fascist society, and with very little rights for anybody, least of all disabled people. And the idea of self-advocacy and my own voice, it took me a long time to find my voice as a person, as a disabled person.
My name is Shuab Chalklen. I'm from South Africa. I'm the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Disability. So I think to transform the rights into action is the responsibility of the governments, first of all, and it's the responsibility of DPOs to hold them to account. And that's the way it happens. My role is to promote the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, to create awareness around it, to provide advice to governments on implementing the convention, also the standard rules and the World Programme of Action. Those are development tools. And I work with the Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities and with the International Disability Alliance. World Congress. I think it's very important because you're dealing with the question of people with intellectual disabilities who are very marginalized and institutionalized, and to integrate them into the mainstream of society. That is the main purpose of Inclusion International, and the sharing of information and best practice and what's happening in different countries. I think it's very important. It deals with Article 32 of the convention, which deals with sharing of information. So I think it's very important.
Wow, I think it's amazing to see very different visuals, very different aspects. There's a lot of people that are in the disability field that are trying their best, and to show that they are able to do that, to be independent, not being reliable on the broader community. So we're going to start a discussion with Shuab. Can you tell us a bit more about why is it that there are so many negative misconceptions about disabled people, and why they are always continuously being pitied or being shamed for having a disability?
Oh, yeah, well, I think that first of all, it's a lack of awareness. So there's a general lack of awareness amongst the public, and we need to create more awareness, right? Organizations of people with disabilities, the government mostly. I think they should do more communications, work with the media, TV, radio, print media, to dispel all these negative perceptions that people have of people with disabilities. For example, we could also use like the Deaf Games or the Paralympics to use those sporting events, positive images of people with disabilities to dispel these myths. And then also importantly to ensure that people with disabilities are included in jobs and education and all of these kinds of life changing opportunities that everybody else have, but there are barriers to including people with disabilities. So those barriers need to be removed, and those barriers are to a large extent they are there because of a particular mindset, people's lack of awareness, first of all, of the rights of people with disabilities, their fundamental human rights, their right to be included, their right to be heard, their right to participate, to be part of society. All these kind of fundamental human rights are the kinds of things that we need to advocate continuously for, and to make sure that the public is informed.
Wow, I think that is quite important and valuable. An important and valuable message that needs to be shared with all viewers, specific companies, governments, etc. Also, what you've mentioned is quite inspiring, also because using those platforms to negate those negative misconceptions is very important, and we are doing it at the right time and on the right platform. Specifically on the show, we want to show that that is possible and that those misconceptions are diminished. But we are not done with you yet, Shuab. We will continue our discussion after the ad break. So we'll just have to take a short break and we'll be back. We are back from our quick break, and we are continuing our engagement with our disability advocate today, Mr. Shuab. And he's a well-known advocate. He's worked on international fields, nationally and provincially, and in the many different regions. So Shuab, you mentioned earlier that there are negative misconceptions, there's a lack of awareness. Right now in South Africa, what do you think is the biggest challenge for disability in general? What do you think is the biggest barrier?
Well, I mean, there are many barriers. I think one of the challenges, I mean, there's a few, right? I think that there are still challenges with regards to access to education. That's a continuous challenge we have. I think the government, they made progress, but not enough. I think they can do more on education. There's also challenges with healthcare, especially for people who are not living in the big cities. Right? If you move out of the big cities, out of Cape Town or Johannesburg or Durban, and if you go into smaller towns, then there's big challenges for people with disabilities. And then there's also a problem with housing. Right? So I know many people with disabilities who are severely disabled, for instance, who cannot access housing. They cannot live on their own. They've got to live in frail care centers. So you will find, for instance, a young person who are maybe 20, 25, 30 years old with a severe disability, could live in the community. There's no housing available for him. So he ends up living in an old age home at that age. So that's very, very sad to see those kinds of, the level of discrimination and the lack of opportunities in housing, education and healthcare. And these are the three things that I think are most important. There's one more, if I can mention. One more thing that I think is also important is that the vast majority of people with disabilities live on a disability grant, right? The monthly money that they get from the state. And I think that is very, very low. Nobody can live on that amount of money. I think it's 1,800 Rand, something, almost 1,900 Rand, but it's just nobody can live on that. I think that's a major, major challenge for us.
Wow, that's very true. With all the challenges, SASSA, healthcare, etc., it is very true. Those are challenges and that happen every single day. With your experience, can you tell us more about your role and what it is that you do in the disability field, and also share tips that you've shared with the broader community on how to change the current situation.
Okay, so right now I'm working for an organization called the African Disability Forum. So it works in Africa. We work in 43 countries in Africa. And our head office is in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And we have a small office here in Cape Town where I work from. At the moment I'm at home, but normally I'm in my small office here in Cape Town. And what we do primarily is that we advocate in different countries for the implementation of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. For instance, I just mentioned one of the challenges we have in South Africa with the SASSA grant, the disability grant. In most countries in Africa, the majority of countries, there is no grant at all, right? So people live in extreme poverty. And that is one of our main challenges that we focus on, how to get people some form of social protection and healthcare and some opportunities in education and so on. So these are the things that we are focused on. So currently I'm the director of this organization.
Wow, it's amazing to see what you are doing. And I'm sure that the changes that need to be made will be done. Just for example, if you were the president of this country, tell me what would be the 5 priority or the key things that you would focus on. Give us 5 words that you think would be priority for you, and also at the same time give more of a clearer perception of what disability is about.
Well, I mean, if you look at the question is, what should government's priorities be? Right? What should government be focusing on? And I think that I mentioned, the key challenges around education, healthcare, housing, the low grant that we have. And another thing that I wanted to add, if we add another 5th one, would be transportation. Transport for people with disabilities, right? That's a major challenge. Getting accessible transport, because without transport you are prevented from accessing opportunities, right? You cannot be fully included, you're going to be stuck at home. It's a challenge to get anywhere. And that transport becomes a critical component, of the priorities that government should have. So I think that you asked me the question also. So I'm mentioning the government priorities, but you also asked me the question before of what should we be doing, right? So let's be clear that it's the government's responsibility to implement the services and to provide an inclusive society. It is not your responsibility as Jabaar or DEFSA or South African Council for the Blind or Disabled People South Africa or any disabled person or the organization. That's not our job. That is the government's job.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And what you've said and shared with us today, I think that it really is important things, and I know there's more than 5 key priorities that government needs to focus on. For the viewers that are watching us, as well as those that find themselves in those fields, I'm sure they've learned a lot. So thank you again for joining us today and for sharing your experience with us.
My pleasure.
So now we are going to have a quick ad break and we'll be back after that. We are back from the break. We are continuing our discussion on disability versus disease, and we have another special guest with us today, is Dr. Fatima Khan. She is a specialist in pediatrics and works with children, and she knows a lot of differences specifically within disability and with disease. So we're looking forward to hearing from her. Welcome, Dr. Khan.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be a part of the show and part of the guest speakers, and just getting something from a different aspect of peds, and being taken away from the crazy ward inside for a couple of minutes. So I'm quite honored to be here today.
Thank you so much, Fatima. We really do appreciate your time. I know that it's quite difficult during this COVID phase. Earlier I was speaking with our previous guest about disability. Many people are quite confused between disability and disease. For example, TB they think is a disability, etc. So from your medical perspective, can you give us the difference?
So I think we must start by understanding what is disease, what is illness. And I think it's important to realize that that's something acute, something that happened now that can quickly either get better or it can get worse. So yes, illness can lead to the disability, where disability leads to the dysfunction or a problem with mental function, physical function of the body. So yes, we can have TB as the illness that can then lead to disability, where, for example, TB causing destruction of your lungs, and then later on the child becomes disabled because they might need chronic oxygen for their entire life. So then they end up having to be where they are then required to have something assist them for life, which makes them disabled. The same like where we have children who get then the TB that spreads to their bone or their spine, and they need surgical interventions, and some of them lose the ability to walk, and they need assistance with walking or wheelchairs, and that then becomes a disability. So illness is the acute part that we see and that we hope to pick up and manage it very nicely in terms of getting the appropriate treatment and actually avoiding the disability completely. But in actual fact, a disability can happen because of the illness or the disease. So I hope that clears up a little bit about the differentiation between the two.
Very, very clear, yes. Thank you so much for that valuable explanation. Also, I wanted to ask, maybe if you could brief us about your experience on working with children, specifically working with disabled children. We know that you've worked at Red Cross, and what have you picked up during your time there or working with disabled children that you can share that advice with parents today?
So I think working with children, I was in the Eastern Cape. I came to Red Cross, and now I'm lucky to be on top of the hill in Wynberg at Victoria Hospital. And I think one of the biggest things that we see is that where our people come from. So I serve a very poor community, and that is my passion, where I want to serve people who needs me. So what we must just remember is that across the board, we have people who they are disabled, but what really strikes me is that the understanding of everyone else to this person. So you usually, so now we get someone in a wheelchair who's maybe living in Hout Bay in one of the informal settlements, and they get sent, the big things that I feel like as an understanding is the baby comes in, was previously well, was an active little running around and playing, now all of a sudden gets sick and gets sent home in a wheelchair. So what I've experienced is a very little times do we actually say, where do they come from? Do they have accessibility? How are they going to get home with this wheelchair? So we see the mommy standing with a buggy outside the hospital, waiting for a taxi to come, waiting for a bus to come. And then we realize mommy doesn't work, mommy doesn't have an income. She has to now pay for 2 seats in the taxi with this massive wheelchair. So I think a lot of the times it's our understanding and trying to kind of be cognizant about the entire dynamic of family, of looking at the bigger picture of how all of this fits in. And then we always go, oh, but this mommy's pushing into the queue now, and that mommy. And sometimes we must just step back and think, wow, this mommy is now coming from wherever and whatever background, having to sit with a now disabled child who was previously well, and just to think of all the things that this mom's going through and how we can help to make those things easier. So it is coming along, being courteous and saying, Mom, can I help you fold your wheelchair up before you get into the taxi?
I also want to say big thank you again for your time, for giving us a bit brief on your background and what you've been exposed to and your experience. So thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you all so much for having me here. Thank you.
So now we will have more information displayed about disability versus disease and who you can contact to find out more. Thank you for watching Accessibility with Jabaar. Goodbye.